welcome everybody. It's great to see so many people here. My name is Bhante Akaliko. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a queer Buddhist monk and also the founder of Rainbodhi LGBTQIA+ Buddhist community. It's really great to see so many people joining us from all around the world today. And so because many of you are international, I'll just let you know, in Australia, we have a very long First Nations history and a much shorter colonial history. And it's customary in Australia to begin a meeting or an event with an acknowledgement of country. And this acknowledgement of country reminds us of the complicated history that we have and reminds us to think about the traditional custodians of the land which we meet on. And so this is something that we do at the beginning of most meetings. So my acknowledgement of country today is to say that I'm meeting with you on Barramadagal lands. This is of the Darug Nation, the people who are the traditional custodians of this place. And we pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. And we acknowledge that this land was never ceded and that this is, was, and always will be Aboriginal land. And so welcome everybody to this online session. And for those who don't know that much about Rainbodhi, Rainbodhi is a Buddhist spiritual friendship group for LGBTQIA+ Buddhists. And we organise community events in real life, we organise online events, and we also advocate for queer, trans and intersex rights and acceptance in the broader society as well as in Buddhist communities. So one thing I want to make sure you all understand is that you are welcome here, that you are accepted and loved for exactly who you are and just as you are. So this is a place where you belong and you are part of the Rainbodhi family and we are here for you. Before we introduce our speaker, I just want to remind you that this is a good opportunity for us to listen to the Dhamma. And when we listen to Dhamma, it's good to create a special space where we are paying attention in a different way to any kind of other activity that we might do. So please consider this environment as your virtual meditation hall. So please behave in a way that's appropriate for a meditation hall. Maybe remove any distractions that might be around you and see if you can really be present and aware and listening with a Dhamma mind to what's going on today. So today we're very lucky to have a talk on queer joy from Bhante Sumano. So Venerable Sumano is a dear friend of Rainbodhi and he is coming to us from Empty Cloud Monastery in New Jersey in the USA. Bhante Sumano has a range of talents. He's a writer, he's very interested in social justice, he's a funny guy who I have a good relationship with and value his friendship because he's shown me many things about Buddhism and also about awareness of minority issues. And so I think we're going to learn a lot from Venerable today. And I'll leave him to introduce himself in his own words, but I thank you for joining us and I'd like to hand over to our very special guest, Venerable Sumano.
So thank you, Bhante, for that introduction. And welcome to everyone who's here. Good to see some new faces and some familiar faces, actually, too. Very surprising, a pleasant surprise. Some of my friends from the New York area and other people I know are here. So that brings me lots of joy, actually. So today I proposed the topic queer joy, which is interesting because right after sending that email to Bhante Akaliko, I then had to stop and think about what exactly queer joy is. I think I just had like a little burst of inspiration, sent the email, and I was like, oh, wait a minute, I have to actually figure out what it is I'm going to talk about. But I've had some weeks now to roll the idea around in my head. So hopefully these reflections will be useful for all of you, most of you, some of you. Zoom is very interesting. I would love to see everyone's faces, but you can't see everyone at the same time. So if you see my eyes sort of doing this, it's just because I'm every now and then trying to look and see everyone. So for today, I actually wanted to sort of flip the script a little bit. So I propose that we can start off with some meditation, but then from the meditation, we'll have some breakout rooms for a little discussion. And then some time for me to share some reflections. And after that, some time for Q&A. So before the meditation, I'll just share a little bit about myself. So like Bhante Akaliko mentioned, I'm a queer monk here at Empty Cloud Monastery in New Jersey. I identify as gay specifically, but I do also identify as queer, feeling very much a part of the queer community. And I'm also Black, Jamaican. So that's a very interesting intersection often to show up as a cis male, Black, gay man in robes. And I'll speak a little bit about that during my talk. But suffice it to say that my experience inhabiting these identities has been, for the most part, very joyful, very fruitful. And even though there have been challenges and difficulties, which I'm sure all of us have experienced to some extent or another, there have also been great moments of awakening, if you will, that I honestly feel if I didn't have this experience, that I wouldn't have had access to, or that access would have been to a much more limited degree. So I want to recognize that for each of us, in a lot of ways, we have these opportunities to really tap into something rare and unique, even though a lot of times it does also come with side effect, maybe consequence of some challenges and troubles along the way. So that said, we can start with some meditation. So we'll be sitting for about 15 minutes. So I invite you to find a comfortable posture. We tend to underestimate the importance of posture when it comes to meditation, but it can really set us up for a useful experience, a very fruitful experience, especially for someone that deals with pain or if we get agitated by staying still. So if we set ourselves up stably, comfortably, it's easier for the mind to settle and for the body to settle as well. So if you're in a chair, I invite you to sit upright. So try not to lean back into the chair, even though it might be really comfy. We want to keep ourselves alert, stable. If possible, both feet on the ground or something propping the feet up, but at least have our backs upright, but not uptight, as we like to say. And if you're on the floor, on a cushion or a mat, the instructions are more or less the same, but sitting cross-legged, preferably with the knees touching the ground or towel or cushion. But if that's not possible, for a short meditation, any cross-legged position is fine. And to get started, you can just take a deep inhale and a deep exhale. You're just coming back to the experience of the body, the experience of the breath, just as it is right now. You don't have to come with the motivation to change anything or do anything in particular. But we're just giving our body and mind the opportunity to rest, to relax. This doesn't usually take much effort because that's sort of the natural resting place of the body and the mind. The body and the mind want to rest, want to relax. It just so happens that we have a habit of doing a lot. So for at least the next 15 minutes or so, we can do less. Maybe even do nothing. Just being present wherever we are, however we are. And if you haven't already, you can close the eyes if that feels comfortable. Just allow ourselves to come back. With the breath as an anchor, with the body as an anchor. And if at any time during the meditation, the mind wanders off, you can just come back. No need to struggle, resist, criticize, or shame. Just go, come back. So I'll offer a theme that you can reflect on during the meditation, if you'd like. And that theme is the theme of joy. So you can bring to mind one thing that brings you joy. It might be a phrase, the image of someone dear to you smiling. Maybe there's someone next to you, and that someone can be a human, a beloved pet, a friend. Or even a place, a time, a moment, anything that stirs the feeling of joy within. And when you call that to mind, just pay attention to any sensation in the body that accompanies that thought, that recollection. You might experience that as warmth in the chest, a tingling, or it might even just be a sense of calm. If you feel yourself wanting to smile, then go ahead. You can also be aware of that sensation, that feeling. And we can just sit with that feeling for a few moments. The feeling of being with or seeing someone or something that brings us joy. And whatever feeling or sensation that's come up, we can encourage that feeling to stay for a while and even expand. If that was a sensation in the chest area, you can just imagine that feeling of joy spreading through the whole body. That feeling of relaxation or stillness spreading through the whole body. Like we're bathing in joy or wrapping ourselves in a snug blanket. Just letting those feelings permeate the whole body. And if that feels comfortable, you can stay there. But there's no reason to limit that joy just to our bodies or even to ourselves. We can practice spreading that joy, that energy of appreciation in every direction. Outwards as a ball of energy, perhaps, just expanding in front, behind, beside, above, below. Expanding outwards to encompass every and any living being it reaches. You might start small, just trying to expand this to the room we're in. But again, we can keep going, expanding outwards, building, neighborhood, town, city, province, state. A whole country even, if we have it in us. A whole continent, a whole world. Spreading that joy outward, while still knowing that we too are bathed in that energy. We too can experience that joy. Because it's for all living beings, including ourselves. I invite everyone to relax your posture, stretch a little if need be. I always recommend that you don't have to leap out of the meditative frame of mind, so you can still hold on to any feelings of serenity or peace that are still lingering. We don't have to kick them out that fast. And if possible, maybe you can hold on to it throughout the entire session. So I mentioned before that rather than having breakout groups later in the session, I actually proposed having them now. So for about 8 to 10 minutes or so, people can have an opportunity just to reflect on really two questions. And one is, what does joy mean to you? So that's our theme for the day, or for the evening, wherever you are. What does queer joy mean to you? So there is something specifically about the title queer joy. So you can speak about that in particular, or even joy in general. And then how does it or does it not show up in your life? So you can take those questions as far as you'd like, but the idea is that each person in the group will have about 2 minutes or so to share. So I believe Ben will be taking care of splitting people up. So you can just share from the heart. We don't have to impress anybody here, especially since we are all friends in one way or another, I think. But really just what feels right. If you have trouble with your connection, or for some reason you wouldn't like to speak, then it would be nice to still share in the chat. I believe when you're in a breakout room, the chat is specific to the breakout room. So yeah, so what does queer joy mean to you, and how does it show up in your life? So welcome back, everyone. I apologize if some people got pulled out mid-sentence, but I know in our group, Miguel, you were sharing, but we heard most of what you said and it was very welcome. So thanks, everyone. Hopefully each of your groups were meaningful. So I will share some reflections on the theme, queer joy. I have a little slideshow, so let me just see if I can share this correctly. And okay, can everyone see that? Yes, perfect. So just before I begin, though, I want to share a little bit about just some of what I heard in my group, and I imagine that in other groups there were similar conversations, but around the topic of queer joy, there was a lot of talk on the joy of acceptance, accepting oneself, accepting others, the joy of community, relationships, having chosen community actually too. Something that's very meaningful about really finding the people that you want to surround yourself with. There's also the joy of perspective, the joy of seeing the world in a particular way, and simply the joy of being allowed to be oneself. So knowing that one can inhabit a space or be in a space where one is accepted, no strings attached. So that's a little bit about what I'll be talking about today, the Buddhist perspective on this. And I would say that I don't necessarily think the Buddhist perspective is that strange, but I'm biased a little bit. I mean, I'm wearing these robes after all. But there is something about the Buddhist path that I think in particular has drawn all of us here, even if we don't necessarily identify as Buddhists. There's something about the Buddha's teachings that invite us to show up as we are. So I have this little doodle by Venerable Vimalanjani, who was here for a moment, but I don't know if Venerable is still here. But I love this picture because it's pure joy. So again, I'm Bhante Sumano. I grew up in Jamaica. My pronouns are he, him. I put a little asterisk there because it dawned on me. I was listening to a talk about queer ancestors, Black queer ancestors. And the presenter, who's a Black gay man, said his pronouns were he, him, but also she, her. And it dawned on me that when I'm speaking with my friends, a lot of times we do refer to each other as she, her, like, oh, she's so noisy. Sometimes it's not, it's not necessarily the most wholesome. We're maybe making a little jab or insulting our friends. But I thought about it a bit more, and actually often we just say it, oh, she's cooking dinner, or oh, she's on the phone, and we're talking about cis men for the most part. So I put an asterisk there for that, because I also want to recognize that sometimes in different spaces, we do have different identities. So before I start, I do want to make some acknowledgements. Like Bhante Akaliko mentioned, we also do land acknowledgements here often. And so I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from what's now called West Orange, New Jersey, which is the ancestral land of the Ramapo Lenape Indian nation. They are here today, living. They've been here for, well, generations, centuries, thousands of years. And they're descendants of the Lenape people. And it is good to recognize this because they, the native peoples of the United States and around the world, have also experienced a kind of erasure and discrimination that I think queer people in particular, even if we're not native, can understand. So I want to recognize these people in particular from here in New Jersey. I also want to acknowledge my Black queer ancestors, such as Marsha P. Johnson, who, or without whom, I should say, me living the life that I live actually would not have been possible. So people who have fought for rights and risked their lives, their relationships, their joy, actually, to bring better conditions to future generations. And then I also want to acknowledge those living in dangerous and unfriendly conditions today. So there's no shortage of suffering in the world. And my hope is that with our practice and with our continued dedication really to cultivating peace, cultivating acceptance, cultivating joy, that we can contribute in wholesome ways to ending those conditions for others. I grew up in particular in a country that is one of those places that's difficult to live in when you're queer, when you're different in any sort of way. And I send them a lot of love, even though I'm not there anymore. I can't say whether that helps them in tangible ways that I can put on a spreadsheet, but it is something to keep in mind that we don't just practice for ourselves, but we also practice for others. So, get started. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namastami. So I love reading the early discourses of the Buddha, because when you do, you really get a sense for the flavor of the teachings. And you realize just how vast, on one hand, the teachings are, but just how loving and compassionate the Buddha was, but also this path of practice that we've been carrying on for generations. So this quote, all sentient beings, all living things, all creatures, each and every one, may they only meet with good fortune, may misfortune not come to anyone. In a lot of ways, this really describes Buddhist practice in its entirety. So we're practicing unconditional love, unlimited joy for all beings, including ourselves. And that's something that, unfortunately, a lot of religions, a lot of spiritual practices, a lot of spiritual spaces have not always done the best job at communicating, even if they've had the intention. And unfortunately, too, for queer people, this relationship to happiness, to acceptance, and to joy has not always come easily. So this comic is by a gay artist, Adam Ellis. He's somewhat popular here in the United States. If you're familiar with Marie Kondo's book, Spark, I don't remember how to, the something art of tidying up. I can't remember the name. But anyway, it's about keeping the things that spark joy and getting rid of the things that don't. And I think the comic here is pretty clever because it captures sometimes these feelings of insecurity and inferiority that we can have if we've grown up hearing all of our lives or experiencing all of our lives discrimination or ideas about us not being worthy or not being loved or accepted. We can think that we're not worthy, whether consciously or not consciously, not worthy of feeling joy, not worthy of feeling happy. So I asked in the breakout rooms for people to leave space also for how joy may not necessarily show up in our lives, because for some people, it's actually quite difficult. For some people, it's quite difficult to accept that they are worthy of everything that anyone else is worthy of. Whether this shows up as internalized queer phobia of some kind, or whether this shows up in self-destructive habits, in mental illness, physical illness, there's oftentimes a part of us that is hurt, that's wounded, but that doesn't feel like it deserves to heal. So part of the talk is actually my encouragement to give us space for that healing, to give ourselves space for that joy and happiness. And so there's a lot of color in this presentation. There's a lot of smiling and a lot of over-the-top, flamboyant joy, because sometimes we do need to be over-the-top and extravagant to balance the real tragedy that exists often, the real difficulties that are there on the path for queer people in particular. So joy in Buddhism, it's sort of amorphous term because there's so many different ways that this is encompassed. And in the language of one collection of the early discourses, the Pali Canon, there are many different words that touch on different aspects of joy. There's pamoja, happiness, sukha, pleasure, and upekkha, equanimity. And I believe these are all different aspects of joy in one way or another because they all point to an element of joy that we touch in different parts of our lives and different parts of our practice. And they're also sort of different levels of joy, if you will. So some are more fleeting, some are more viscerally enjoyable, and some are this baseline joy, baseline happiness that we can tap into anytime throughout the day. So for simply happiness in particular, just this feeling of feeling happy, one of the ways that we can cultivate this is by being generous. And when I first heard this teaching, I was like, okay, generosity, yeah, sure, that will make me happy. And we can sometimes undermine the power of generosity. Oftentimes because we think being generous means, say, giving money to a charity or volunteering at a soup kitchen. Those are ways to be generous. But there's also generosity of heart, generosity of mind, generosity of our simple, mundane, daily interaction with others. So I have this picture of Audre Lorde because she embodies a generosity that you can't really quantify in some ways. She's passed away now, but the generosity of standing up for others, the generosity of loving others, of accepting others, the generosity that we can offer ourselves. And when we really pay attention to that sort of generosity, we can feel that it just expands the heart. We don't have to be this shriveled self, just trying to make it on our own in the world. We can know that even if we don't have anything else to give one another, we can at least give each other acceptance. We can give each other love. So that's one form of happiness that I would encourage us not to discount. Another kind is virtuous conduct. And again, I was like, oh, God, I need the secret formula for happiness, not these things that, is sort of common sense. But even though they're common sense, oftentimes we ignore them because we take them for granted. And virtuous conduct falls in that realm as well, because we realize when we do pay close attention to these forms of happiness that we've taken for granted, that there's a reason, for example, the Buddha constantly over and over and over again talks about virtuous conduct. And the reason is because when we're virtuous, we don't have regrets. And not having regrets it's like a feeling of lightness, a feeling of freedom. And that can be a source of happiness, a source of joy. Of course, we make mistakes, probably lots of mistakes throughout our day, but it's not about being perfect. Rather, it's about a commitment to recognizing when we've fallen short of our own expectations, and how we can grow from that, how we can remedy that. I say this specifically too, because I know for myself, especially if I'm around my friends, we can sometimes interact in ways that are fun and joyful, and I'll overgeneralize, hopefully not too much, but us gay guys can sometimes be quite mean to each other. And we don't recognize often that it can be all fun and games, but sometimes what we do and what we say also has this barb, has this effect of tearing each other down, when really we should be supporting one another. So that's another reason why I say it's not something that should be neglected, is because it's so easy to slip into old habits, and so easy to inhabit the habits of the people who have actually tried to push us down our whole lives. Another cause of happiness is recollecting the Buddha, specifically. So this is something, again, that I took for granted, but simply bringing to mind thoughts of compassion, thoughts of joy, thoughts of freedom, and knowing that there was a person who promoted this for all living beings. So if you don't have somebody in your life who believes in you, who believes that you matter, who believes that you're accepted, well, the Buddha believed it. And you just have to bring that to mind. And that alone can be a source of happiness. You're not alone, even though you may be physically alone, even though everyone around you might be telling you otherwise. There is something that you can hold on to. There is a raft that you can use to, as best as you can, make the most of the situation that you're in. And that goes hand in hand with practicing. So I don't know if there are any new practitioners here, but simply practicing, simply sitting down for meditation, simply going for a walk, being with our feelings of sadness, stress, joy, happiness, excitement, just being there for ourselves can be a source of happiness. We start to pay attention to those parts of ourselves that we've ignored, sometimes actively, sometimes because of trauma, because we're too busy, because it's too painful. But when we give ourselves the space and the time to really be with ourselves in the practice, to really allow there to be a sort of venting, an opening, then we see that there are these little bits of happiness that we can tap into. And it's the happiness of simply being alive, being able to even reflect on these things, an opportunity that not everyone has. And like lots of people mentioned, good friendship is a cause of happiness too. So if we're lucky enough to have people in our lives, one person, two people, three, a dozen, more, constantly reflecting on that and holding each other up, supporting each other is another way that we can encourage happiness to arise and encourage it to stay. So all of these, I hope, sound actually quite boring and you're like, Bhante, I already know all of this stuff. I hope that's what you're coming away with, because then you're doing great. Then you are really already on the path to joy and happiness. And don't take my word for it, but here's another quote from the Buddha. But when someone recollects these topics, their mind is not full of greed, hatred, and delusion. At that time, their mind is unswerving, and one whose mind is unswerving finds joy. When you're joyful, rapture springs up. When the mind is full of rapture, the body becomes tranquil. And when the body is tranquil, they feel bliss. So these all sort of compound or build on each other. And when we have the time and the space to allow these qualities to blossom and to sprout, then we can see that this is true in our experience. When we have a generous and peaceful mind, when we surround ourselves with good people, then it's almost like we don't have to, oh, I wish I were happy. What can I do to be happy? It comes naturally. When someone walks into the room that you love, that you want to see, you automatically smile. You already feel a lightness in the body. When you walk down the street and you know that if someone needed help, you would do it. You don't have to walk down the street like, oh, God, I hate human beings. Why do I have to live in this wretched place? You already have this feeling of openness, of acceptance. And that primes the mind for what we love to focus on, which is meditation. So oftentimes we jump to meditation without setting a foundation. And the foundation for meditation is actually happiness, it's peacefulness. So we think we have to meditate in order to be happy and in order to be peaceful. But in some ways, it's actually the other way around. To really benefit from our meditation practice, we already have to set up peaceful conditions. We know we need a quiet place most of the time, but we also need a mind that has not been weighed down, that's not been bogged down with unwholesome mind states, negative mind states. So when we're happy, we set the conditions for pleasure. And it's a pleasure that comes from letting go. So contrary to what economists might believe, or CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, we won't find happiness from accumulating more, from getting more, from taking more from the world, but rather in letting go and giving up. There's in the suttas the phrase nekama sukha, which is the pleasure of renunciation. And so in this quote from Ajahn Chah, if you let go a little, you have a little happiness. If you let go a lot, you have a lot of happiness. And if you let go completely, you'll be completely free. And the Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh would say, well, letting go of what? And well, we're letting go of what doesn't help us, what doesn't serve us, the things that shackle us. The typical three are greed, hatred, and delusion. But when we hear these terms, we really do have to personalize it for ourselves. So what is it that's weighing us down? What is it that we're holding on to, even though it's not helping us, even though it's not serving us? Is it a toxic relationship? Is it an addiction to something? Is it our relationship even to ourselves, to our past? There's a meditation in particular, meditation on yourself as a 5-year-old child, that's very powerful. It's practiced in the Plum Village tradition. And it's really taking a moment to imagine ourselves as the young person who really had no roadmap for this life, who suffered a lot at the hands of others. But have we really given ourselves time to let that 5-year-old child really be heard, really be seen? And so we carry this burden around with us often, knowingly or unknowingly. But when we sit down and take the time to try and understand ourselves, then that's something that we can let go of, finally, once and for all. So letting go as a cause for pleasure, again, it's natural. When we let go of something, we're lighter. When we're traveling internationally, if we have 5 different suitcases and a backpack and a purse, and we have scarves and hats and boots and all of that, when we finally get to our destination, we just want to throw it down and drop into bed. Because the whole time we've been weighed down by baggage, by all of this luggage. So when we let that go, then there's already lightness there. There's already peace. And the final stage that I wanted to touch on is equanimity. And it's a final stage, but it's also in some ways the container for happiness, pleasure, and joy as well. Because equanimity is what allows us to accept that we're not always joyful, we're not always smiling, we're not always peaceful. Even the people that seem like it are not always joyful and peaceful. So this quote, "Too much joy is lost in our desperation to keep it," I like because it's like a counterbalance sometimes. We don't always have to be the life of the party. We don't always have to be the person who has it all together. We don't have to be perfect. And this is something that I know personally I've struggled with as someone who had a real issue with perfectionism as a way to make up for what I saw as a flaw within myself. So if I was perfect, then no one could criticize me. If I was perfect, then my parents would love me, society would love me, no one would have any reason to hate me. But that logic was already flawed from the beginning. Nothing that I did was going to make other people accept me in one sense. And in the other sense, this attempt to be perfect was flawed. This attempt to be perfect was not coming from a place of actually accepting and being inclusive. So when we can accept ourselves, when we can be with the fact that joy may come after some challenges, that joy may leave, that there will be sadness, pain, and difficulty, then paradoxically, it actually sets the conditions for us to experience more joy, ease, and satisfaction in the future. There was a day not too long ago, actually, where I was really grumpy. If you know me, it's rare actually that I have a day like that. I'm usually, my baseline is pretty just like that. So not necessarily joyful, but just, oh, okay. But I hated everyone. I didn't want to see anybody. I didn't want to talk to anybody. But at one point I was just like, oh, wow, the mind is so grumpy today. Oh, wow. I'm just going to get up and do all the things that I usually do. I'm going to eat. I'm going to meditate. I'm going to do yoga. I'm going to go to sleep, and I'm going to wake up. And maybe I'll be grumpy tomorrow. Who cares? And I did that. And the next day, I was actually fine. Like the next day, I was back to quote unquote normal. And I was like, oh, wow, that was a stormy day. But sometimes when we experience the difficulties, the challenges, the sadness, the anger, the reaction can be one of stoking the flames, of hating the fact that we feel like this, hating ourselves. Why do we have to feel this way? We need to be happy. We need to be peaceful. This is what the Buddha's teachings are about. But actually, the Buddha's teachings are about being responsive to the situation we find ourselves in. And so if there is a moment of difficulty, then we just meet that moment as it is, and we meet it with equanimity. And just like in the previous passages, we see that by doing that, by being peaceful, even in the midst of the storm, we're actually creating the conditions for the storm to dissipate more quickly. One simile or metaphor that I like was when you're in a boat, if you're, well, I hate boats, so I try not to find myself in one. But when it's rocky and wavy, I had this experience once where the boat was just, it felt like it was about to turn over. And my friend was just like, just sit down, hold on to the railing and just be still, and you'll feel so much better. You're moving with the wave. Rather than I was like getting up and trying to walk around and I was being thrown from side to side. It seemed counterintuitive to my friend. It was like, oh, when things are rocky, you stay still, you have patience, you wait. But I was panicked. So of course I was running around. But that's our response oftentimes to challenges and difficulties. But in that running around and in that franticness, we oftentimes make the situation worse for ourselves. And so these 3 ways, they're just short, simple ways of tapping into joy in our lives, allow us then to share this with others. So this inclusiveness, this acceptance, this joy, this love, this really radical way of being in the world is something that we can share with anyone, with everyone. So we spoke in the groups about having that perspective. Having suffered in some ways allows us to not want other people to suffer because we know what it's like. It allows us to really share the experience of acceptance, of friendliness, of compassion with others because we know what it's like to have been on the receiving end of harm or misunderstanding or discrimination. And at the end of the day, this is what Buddhist practice is about. It is about accepting others. It is about accepting ourselves and cultivating boundless compassion, boundless joy, boundless equanimity and friendliness, not just for ourselves, but for the whole world, and not just for the whole world, but also for ourselves. So I like this image. I just found out this cartoon character, a gay cartoon character in a kid's TV show. So radical. But yeah, if we can go around belching rainbows, then I think we're doing a good job. And it's not something that we can always do necessarily. But even having the intention to be someone that cultivates wholesome qualities, someone that cultivates the qualities we wish we could see in the world, does a whole lot. You may not know it. No one may tell you. But just by being, actually, you've already done a lot of good. So those are my thoughts and reflections for this evening. Hopefully they've been of some benefit. If not, that's okay. This was a free talk. You got your money's worth. So if you have any questions, feel free to share. If my co-host or host would also like to chime in.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you very much, Venerable, for that talk and for touching on so many different aspects of Buddhist path, but queer experience and personal experience as well. And I think this series of talks that we've been organising with Rainbodhi have been really instructive to really bring a focus of queer experience to the Dhamma and to see how much of our actions in the queer community, caring for others, caring for self, social justice issues, looking after various identity groups, how these are actually actions of love, and that we are cultivating aspects of the path like generosity, compassion when it's needed, acceptance and equanimity when there's nothing we can do. And so I think it's really great that we have this opportunity to reflect on how we are doing the path, doing it in a queer way, and it's valid and it's necessary and it's wonderful and beautiful. And your talk today was a great expression of that. So I'm not sure if there's been any questions. I'd love it if you could answer a few.
Sure.
One question I had for you, Venerable, and please anyone else put one in the chat, is some people in our group mentioned the difficulty of just accessing that joy. And it's true that sometimes it feels so remote from us. And you mentioned these kind of slow burn practices of cultivating sila, ethical conduct, or cultivating generosity, or whatever. But why is it, do you think, that sometimes joy feels so far removed from us? And what does it feel like to experience joy?
I know that for myself, actually, and this is something I was unaware of before I started practicing, but there's a little voice in my head that does not want me to succeed in life. And I don't know where it came from and why it's there. But there's a part of me, I have to admit, that believes I shouldn't be happy. And I think for a lot of us, there's that voice. Sometimes it's louder than it should be, really. And sometimes it's even the only voice that we hear. And what's been really useful for me, and this comes from Buddhist practice, is recognizing that that voice is not me. It's not mine. Because how could anyone really that doesn't want you to succeed be something you should listen to or to claim? And so for me, it's actually been an active process of when that voice comes up to being like, oh, there's that voice that doesn't want me to succeed. Yeah, I don't have to listen to you. It's almost like, if you were just walking down the street and someone walked up to you and said, oh, you need to wear like a different pair of shoes. You'd be like, who are you? I don't even know you. Like, leave me alone. And Ajahn Chah, actually, I think it was Ajahn Chah, or one of the Thai forest teachers, actually says sometimes when these thoughts come into your head, you're just like, leave me alone. I don't want to listen to you right now. And so we should acknowledge that that voice is there, but also acknowledge that with the perspective that it's not helping us, it's not serving us. And by listening to that voice less, I've actually been able to listen to the other voice that's also in my head that I've ignored for so long, which is the voice that does want me to succeed. So it's about giving energy to that, which is another slow burn practice, but one that's very quick that I actually like, that I use a lot, is really thinking of my friends' laughter or smiles. Like literally just sitting down, if I'm sitting in meditation and I feel like really tight in my mind, just thinking some ridiculous story, like running in the rain with a friend because we didn't look at the weather forecast and we're completely soaked, like something that can just be a quick pick-me-up, if you will. That helps. I hope that answers the question.
So it seems like there's no more questions. People must be feeling pretty joyful, which is wonderful. And so I'd like to finish up by thanking Venerable Sumano for his talk today. And if you're interested in hearing more from Venerable Sumano, he has lots of talks that he's given through Buddhist Insights for Empty Cloud Monastery on the YouTube channel for Buddhist Insights. And I wasn't sure if it was a question pop-up or my brother who has vascular dementia. This is from Venerable Tong Fat Tay. Tay says, my brother who has vascular dementia is staying with me for a few days. In the middle of reflecting on all that Bhante Sumano was saying about joy, I received a text message from my cousin that says, just checking in on you too. What a lovely day. Hope you're enjoying this time together. A rare happening indeed. Dare I say, maybe God sent. As Jack Cornfield would say, there's much more going on here than Christmas shopping. So I guess there is a lot of things that we can receive joy from, messages from friends and being together. And I think I understood from what Bhante Sumano was saying, it's a good way to turn the mind to those things, to really acknowledge them. And we also have Kevin, who I think would like to ask a question. So Kevin, if you would like to unmute yourself.
Before Bhante, though, real quick, if I can just speak to Tay's comments. The meditation we did in the beginning, sort of meditation on mudita, on joy. So it works. That's what I was thinking. I was like, oh, it actually works. So your cousin was picking up on the joy and felt moved to share it. But actually, that's also another quick way to pull oneself out of a tight and sort of negative mind frame is to do something to bring joy to someone else. So if you're feeling grumpy one day, just send a nice text message to a friend. And that can actually do a lot of good for both of you. So yes. Okay, so Kevin had a question?
Thank you. I worked on a project a number of years ago because I was so tired of seeing Buddhist teachers, monastic and lay, try and squash queer joy out of people. And so my question is, I'm still struggling with this all these years later, both with monastic and lay teachers. It's surprising to sit with you, a monastic, and have these discussions. But how would you, this could be a whole Dhamma talk, but how would you explain to some of these monastic and lay teachers the importance of holding queer and trans joy, and while holding the relative truth of that, and that our identities matter greatly in the day-to-day world, but there's also the absolute truth of anatta. And so it's a two-part question. Like, I've been trying to figure out how to hold both of those things gently while trying to maneuver, monastic spaces and lay spaces, while watching teachers try and crush out queer joy. So if you could share a few thoughts on that big topic, I would appreciate it. Thanks.
Yes. It is a huge topic. It would be a whole session, but a couple of things do come to mind. One, actually, okay, so there's three. I'll keep it to three. One, and they're all different, they're somewhat related things that happened pretty recently, actually. So one was, I was recently in a position where I had to interact with, let's just say, someone who doesn't believe in COVID-19. And so doesn't believe in wearing masks, taking precautions and all of that. And there was this moment where I had to really reflect, and I had to say to myself, is engaging in this conversation going to be of benefit? Is trying to confront or educate or even speak with this person going to be beneficial? And so that's the first question I think we need to ask ourselves when we're in situations like this. Because though it is important to advocate for ourselves and to advocate for others, we also are of limited capabilities, limited energies. And we do have to see, to what extent the actions that we take are going to be helpful both for ourselves and for others. So especially in a dynamic like one that you're describing, especially in a teacher-student dynamic, monastic lay dynamic, what have you, there can be multiple levels to this that make this more complicated than maybe speaking to another person in a different situation. So I would say the first step is to analyze that and to think about that, and decide what you will. It's not to say don't engage or do engage, but just to keep it in mind, because it's something to consider. The second thing that comes to mind is we talk a lot about the the conventional and the ultimate. Personally, I've never been a fan of dividing reality in that way. And one of the reasons for that is because I think it creates this sort of complication, unnecessary complication. So we speak about gender identity, sexual orientation, etc., skin color, race, ethnicity. And there are teachings of not self, and there are teachings of emptiness, and there are teachings of not holding or clinging to anything in the world, which are all very beautiful and lofty and true and have their place. But they don't really apply, and I don't know if this is controversial or not, but they don't really apply to gender identity. They don't really apply to these aspects of our being in the way that they've been done, or that I've seen it done by people who really don't understand. So to clarify that, we all have bodies, for example, but when we break our legs, no one gives us advice that, well, ultimately the body is not you, not yourself, not who you are. So deal with your broken leg. Just sit and meditate. When you have a broken leg, you go to the doctor. When the body is hungry, you feed it. When you're experiencing emotional difficulties, you console yourself, you seek help. So really, to me, the teaching on not self doesn't have much to do with gender identity or sexual orientation, because these are not things that we necessarily need to let go of. They're just functional aspects of our lives, the same way that, you know, my skin color is not something I'm going to scrub away or magic away, but rather it's just something that is. So the third thing, the final thing, is just that when speaking to somebody about these, if we come from a place of compassion and understanding, then I think that usually is what does the trick. So if someone says something insulting, if someone says something that shuts down another person, we can actually just quite simply say, but didn't the Buddha teach compassion? So how does that fit in with what you're saying? And it can be a very genuine question. And see what the response is. And in some ways, the response will tell you how to go from there. But I would say, as my final piece of advice, is do not intentionally put yourself in a situation that's harmful, physically or mentally. Don't intentionally put yourself in a situation that's triggering. All beings are the owners of their actions, and there's only so much you can do. So at the end of the day, protect yourself and protect others. So I got the ding ding, time's running short notification.
Time's running short, and so thank you. And Kevin, thanks for that question. I've often spoken about weaponizing anatta, and that's the way it seems to be often used when it comes to people who identify as LGBTQIA. Suddenly becomes a weapon rather than a tool. You know, it's something we hit people over the head with rather than something that's everyone should be using to work towards their liberation. And one strategy that I have been using just recently before we finish up is just to remind people that when straight, cis people come to the monastery, they often talk about aspects of their lives that are considered normal. And it's fine for people to come and celebrate the birth of a baby. It's fine for people to come and celebrate their marriage or a wedding. And so often the questions that people bring to monks and nuns are about, very straight, very cis kind of questions. And none of this is ever questioned, of course. But suddenly when we bring up something to do with being queer or being trans, suddenly it's like, oh, we can't talk about that, we're Buddhists. But this shutting down is something that we might explore in a further talk. And as always, I really encourage people who come to Rainbodhi to get in touch. If there's something that you want to hear about or something that you want to discuss, please let us know, because we need to have these conversations with all our family. And as we kind of gain momentum and shine light into these areas of queer Dhamma practice, we can develop some strategies and ways to deal with these very common problems that we all experience going into Dhamma centers. And so it's useful to share, and it's useful to discuss, strategize, understand, and work towards change together. And then it's not something that is the onus of one person in one center, but in a group effort that leads to significant change. To everyone for attending. Thank you to all the venerables and members of the international Rainbodhi community who are here. And thank you especially to Bhante Sumano for his insightful talk. And may all of you have a great day, many blessings. May all beings be happy.